the Chinese that goes to Africa now does it with a sort of colonial attitude, then it is a huge problem. And that is what I wanted to discuss. And that combined with another important thing. A little more than 100 years ago, something important in our world happened. It was when the economy of the United States passed the British economy as the world's greatest economy. And this is more than 100 years ago. Now, in about 10 to 15 years, this will happen again, when China will pass the Americas with the biggest economy in the world. We are really, my friends, living in interesting times to see what will happen. And I think that if I look at the Swedish language, where we have a lot of English words in the language, or even in Mozambique, where we speak Portuguese, people suddenly say, é muito nice. It's very good, é muito nice. And I think that in 10 to 15 years we will start to have Chinese words in our language. It's obvious. And I also believe that, well, symbolically, if I had small children today, at least I would contemplate trying to find a Chinese-speaking nanny, because that might be a very good investment for the future. But I don't know whether I would do it or not. But what I try to say, what happened in China, it has such an enormous importance for all of us, whether we want it or not. And especially now, when I thought about what was happening in Africa, that is the point where I decided to write a novel, The Man from Beijing. There is also, when you write fiction, you try to use fiction in a way to talk about serious, important matters. And you have in a way to try to reach the audience. And I think there is a funny thing about how to reach an audience. You know, there is a very critical moment very quickly when you start reading a book. Let's say you start reading here, okay? And you read this first page and you come to the end of the page. Then there is two possibilities. Either you do like that, or you do like that. So in a way you say it's so important to start a novel, because to catch the reader. And I would really say it's much more important how you start a novel than how you finish it. Because if you finish it not very good, well, anyhow the person has read it. But I will come back to that later. And I decided to do this as a very complicated, exciting story, where I wanted to have many things mixed together as a sort of soup. So Sweden exists in the novel, China exists in the novel, China of today and China of yesterday. And Africa exists, and what's more important, even the United States of the middle of the 18th century exist. Because who built the railroads in United States? That was the Chinese. So I tried to make a mixture of all these things to talk about the role that China is playing today. Now, this was obviously for me not a story for Wallander, absolutely not. So I had to create another main character. I don't think any one of you know that my father was a judge, which means that from very early days in my life, I was used to live very close to the system of justice. And it was, by the way, in a way, very, very funny. We lived up north, and there was the courthouse, and we were living once upstairs. And every Thursday, I think it was setting in the courtroom. And I knew for sure after a couple of hours a man would come up from downstairs and ask me for two of my small dinky toys. Because then my father had some problem downstairs with people that had had a traffic accident and they couldn't explain what had happened, and finally he was so tired, so he asked for these small cars, maybe they could explain what had happened. So every Thursday my cars disappeared. And so I was in a way participating in how to deal with at least that kind of problem. But what I wanted to say is that that gave me probably very early on in life a feeling that the system of justice is enormously important for all of us. And we who are very intelligent people sitting here or standing here, we know that if the system of justice doesn't work, democracy won't work. It's as simple as that. But anyhow, I decided now for the first time ever to write about the judge. But in order to distance myself from my father, who is dead since many, many years, I decided to create a female judge. And not only to make problems for myself, but also because of another reason. I wanted to create a character who had had a relation to China in the past. So this judge, this female judge, when she was very young, she was a Maoist. You know, she was one of the girls with a red small little book in their hand. And in Sweden it's possible to become a judge even if you have had that kind of past. Which is absolutely one of the very, very good things with Sweden. We never had any kind of, you know, these problems that you had in the 50s at least, with Mr. McCarthy and others. So I think I found then many, many ways to create this story. And then I came to the point, yes, I will like to write this story. So this, I would say, is one of the few novels I've written where I really could give you exactly how the story was born. And I wanted to write it as a sort of thriller, because that is a very efficient way of telling a story. By the way, there are some people, especially some people who write in newspapers about books, that doesn't know very much about anything really. They sometimes you can read such stupid things that the genre of crime fiction was created, for example, by Edgar Allan Poe, which is nonsense. If we go way back to the ancient Greek playwrights that wrote plays 2,500 years ago, what did they write about? If you take a play like Medea, it's a play about a woman who kills her 2 children because of jealousy. Now, if that is not a crime story, I don't know what the crime story is. The difference is that at that time in the Greek society, there were no police corps. They didn't exist. But if it had existed at that time, I'm quite sure that even in Medea there would have been a police officer. So I think that using the mirror of crime to look upon society and contradictions in society is one of the oldest literary genres that exist. And I think this is very important to remember. When people ask me which is the best crime story I ever read, I normally answer Macbeth by Shakespeare, because it is a tremendous interesting story about politics and violence and, you know, all of these things. So I think it's important to mention this. But back now to the first page, because it is, as I said, important to try to find a way of opening a novel. That this is a novel with a lot of people from all over the world. So I decided to not start with any person at all. I decided to start with an animal. And I think I'm going to read a few lines from the very beginning of the novel. And this opening is called, the chapter 1, I think one says, is called The Epitaph. Frozen snow, severe frost, midwinter. Early in January in 2006, a lone wolf crosses the unmarked border and enters Sweden from Norway. A man on a snowmobile thinks he might have glimpsed it, but the wolf vanishes into the trees, heading east, before he is able to pinpoint it. In the remote Norwegian mountains, The wolf had discovered